Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Asian Heritage Month event on the topic of authentic Asian representation in film. My name is Teresa Wu-Pa, and I'm the chair of the board at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. I'm coming to you today from Calgary, Alberta, which is sitting on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 nations in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot First Nation tribes of Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda, First Nations tribes of Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I want to stress how important it is to understand the history of this land that we all live on and our place within this history. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are integral to the past, present, and future of our nation, and we must all work together towards meaningful reconciliation. Before we begin today's event, I want to let everyone know that simultaneous translation is available and can be accessed by clicking the globe icon for interpretation at the bottom right side of your Zoom window. We also encourage you to provide your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function, and we will respond to them at the end of the webinar. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation was created by the Government of Canada as a Crown Corporation in 1996 as part of the Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement to reaffirm the principles of justice and equality for all in Canada. As Canada's leading agency dedicated to working towards the elimination of racism and all forms of racial discrimination, the CRF is determined to help build a more inclusive and equitable Canadian society. This year, to commemorate Asian Heritage Month, we have collaborated with the National Film Board of Canada and Telefilm Canada to host this panel. Before I go on to set some context for the panel, I would like to pass it to Kathy Wong, the Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and Official Languages from Telefilm Canada, and Rachel DeCoste, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion from the National Film Board of Canada, for brief opening remarks. Turn it over to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. En fait, premièrement, quel plaisir d'être ici autour de la table. Thank you all for joining the conversation today. It is so important for us to be working with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the National Film Board on today's conversation, and especially for Asian Heritage Month. As you know, as Crown corporations, for us, it is important to work together in the fight against racism, discrimination, Asian hate, and in creating more spaces for our communities to share, to learn, and to discuss, and for our industry to grow. And all this is so vital. As you know, also an ongoing effort at Telefilm has been going on with the intention to restructure a lot of our programs and to redefine the way our decision-making are being done in our processes to break down systemic barriers. And we are really working to ensure that our stories are authentically told and respectfully representative. So it is conversations like today that will help improve attitudes and practices to better serve the diversity of voices we have across the country, and including Canada's Asian communities. So thank you very much. I wish you an amazing panel. Merci beaucoup et au plaisir de se reparler. Rachel, to you.
Merci, Cathy. Bonjour tout le monde. Tout d'abord, je veux remercier tous les cinéastes, les créateurs qui animent et participent aujourd'hui. À l'ONF, nous sommes engagés à faire valoir la richesse de la culture et du vécu et des points de vue de toutes les communautés culturelles, incluant les communautés asiatiques. Afin d'appuyer nos efforts, j'ai présenté en février dernier, en 2021, nous avons un plan en matière de diversité, équité et inclusion qui comporte des engagements et des objectifs visant à nous aider à devenir une organisation plus ouverte et plus diversifiée. Le forum d'aujourd'hui s'inscrit dans cet esprit. Before giving the floor to the panelists, I invite you to look at the NFT playlists. We have created playlists that lift the voices of Asian Canadians in our society. It's our hope that these films give viewers both insights and a deeper appreciation of the lives of all Canadians. Those who registered will receive a link to the playlist after the event. Finally, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your stories, and bonne écoute.
Thank you, Kathy and Rachel, for your opening remarks. As many of you know, despite recent successes of Asian artists in Hollywood, Asian representation in film has historically been either scarce or stereotypical at best. It is now more critical than ever to discuss the nature of Asian representation in the film industry. This will help us identify barriers and challenges faced by Asian creators, as well as potential industry strengths and opportunities that can better support them. I'm grateful for today's opportunity to listen to how Asian Canadians in the Canadian film industry have been disrupting these harmful narratives and stereotypes. Your work is making a difference and deserves to be recognized and celebrated for your continuous contributions to our Canadian society. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Without further ado, let me introduce you to today's host of the discussion, Sook-Yin Lee. Sook-Yin Lee is a Canadian filmmaker, musician, actor, multimedia artist, and award-winning radio and TV broadcaster with CBC Radio and TV, BBC, Much Music. We are also joined today by three amazing Asian Canadian filmmakers. First, we have Warren Sonoda. Warren is a BAFTA-winning CSA and Emmy-nominated filmmaker. He is also the first person of color to be elected as the national president of the Directors Guild of Canada in 2020. Agam Darshi is also here with us. Agam is an international award-winning actress and filmmaker. Her directorial debut, Donkey Head, was released on Netflix in January 2022. Last, please welcome Sandi Rankaduwa. Sandi is a Sri Lankan Canadian writer, filmmaker, and comedian. Her most recent film, a short documentary called Icebreakers, was produced by the National Film Board and named a Vimeo staff pick. So I'll turn it over to you, Sook-Yin.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And so great to see you, Agam, Sandi, Warren. Love your work. So good. So good. And I'm excited because we all work within the realm of comedy. And so today comedy helps the medicine go down.
I hope we're funny today. You just set us up. I mean,
no, I mean, it's more like having a sense of humor to it. A tough conversation like this is really crucial. It helps the medicine go down. And comedians are truth tellers. So I really appreciate that. So let's hit it off. My first question to you is, how would you describe authentic Asian Canadian storytelling? That's the name of this panel. What is authentic Asian Canadian storytelling to you? Sandi, do you want to start off? Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's hard to kind of define it because in my mind, for it to be authentic, it has to be very vast and wide spanning and allow for a lot of types of stories. But for me personally, I think it's creating stories that don't necessarily cater or prioritize a white gaze or assume that that's the default audience. That's like how I think I personally strive for authenticity. Yeah.
Agam?
Yeah, what a big question. I've been thinking about it, and I think in its simplest form, it's any piece of work that's created by an Asian North American, and by default, it's going to express their own beliefs and experiences and points of view, and so that's as authentic as you can get.
Yes. Absolutely. That's an interesting perspective. And Warren.
thanks again. I think the last time we saw each other was like a DVD store on Queen Street that was going out of business, and we were quickly buying as many Canadian films as we could.
Yes.
It was amazing.
Green Video.
Yeah, that's right.
R.I.P.
What is the authentic storyteller? And I only have myself to kind of gauge an answer like that. And my relationship to myself and my Japanese heritage is is complicated at best.
Mm.
And it's interesting because the CRRF was created out of the redress movement for the Japanese Canadians after internment, and sort of the formal apology came with a package of compensation for my parents, and also the creation of the CRRF. So this question is interesting to me because, you know, I've made 11 feature films now, but the 11th one, which was a movie called Things I Do for Money, should have been called Things I Do for No Money because it was like a low budget, micro budget movie. But it was the first film that starred two Japanese Canadians. Because before that, I never cast a Japanese Canadian in the lead, or even a supporting lead. And I was wondering, you know, why was that? So when I look back at what I've done, is like, were the things that I did inauthentic because I didn't touch upon, you know, because your question of authentic Asian storytelling, I was still an Asian, I was still Japanese Canadian making movies and telling stories. And I think, Agam kind of said it. It's like any Asian telling a story, whether or not it's specific to my story or my family story, kind of fits the bill for me. But it's interesting, you know, to, you know, in the second part of my career to start investigating that thing for myself.
Absolutely.
That's my long-winded answer, Sook-Yin.
Yeah, for sure. The idea of so Sandi stipulates the sort of counter narrative to the white lens, and then there's a bit more wiggle room in terms of the idea of like any person of color, if they're expressing whatever they wish to express, is an expression of that person.
Taking up the space, right? Because, like, you know, do you think of a Japanese Canadian from Hamilton, Ontario to be the go-to Trailer Park Boys director?
Exactly.
You don't default to that, but it's something that, you know, I enjoy doing, and it doesn't make me less of a filmmaker by doing something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering, you know, how central is being authentic and Asian and Canadian to you in your work? Is that you know, I'm thinking about how you know, my first films as a young person growing up in Vancouver were all about identity, because I'm Chinese Canadian, but I don't fit into either. I'm not from China, I'm not Hong Kong, China. I realized that I adhere to a very specific kind of Canadian Chinese world. But then that was an interest in the early years for me. But then people would sort of constantly want to put me into a box of like, okay, you're doing Canadian Chinese movies. I'm like, wait a minute, what? No. Or, you know, so, and of course, whenever I'm put into a box, I want to break out of that. So curious, you know, I don't want to assume that your identifiers are that you're authentic Asian. And authenticity is a peculiar word too. Like, I'm not even sure what authentic means. So how do you feel about those monikers? Are you okay with claiming them? Or, I mean, Sandi.
Yeah, I think like I don't deny them if people, and I do think if someone were to like to avoid acknowledging the fact that I'm South Asian, I would find it a bit weird. But I think the problem is when other people have associations with what that means, and stereotypes or whatever. And that, yeah, it's like you said, these boxes that go alongside these labels, as long as those are sort of not as rigid, or they allow some leeway, like I don't mind identifying with that. And I think it can also help facilitate community around people who might also be assigned similar labels. So like I embrace it, but I definitely can see why people wouldn't want to be limited to a certain term.
Agam?
So the question is, how do I feel about being identified with these?
Yeah, or not how you feel, but like how big of a, you know, do you say you're a feminist, or do you say, do when you're introduced, do you say I'm a, you know, South Asian Canadian filmmaker? Do you use those hyphenates, or is that part of your way that you choose to identify yourself?
It's so tricky. I also have a complicated relationship with it. And I mean, in some ways it's a shorthand. So it's like, yeah, sure, South Asian, you know, and I've so much of my work actually does explore what that means. But I don't know, I kind of like bump up against it too, because in some ways it's like I can identify with it, but I don't want other people to like label me that. And it's a weird thing because yeah, I think it's what Sandi said, that it's like it has all these other expectations surrounding what it means to be Asian. And so it's kind of like I require a little bit more space and room, you know? So on one hand, like I would love to be known as like a Canadian filmmaker. But I personally would also say, yes, I'm an Asian Canadian filmmaker, but only I can say that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I echo the sentiments. I mean, it's funny because like so my name's Warren. I have two older brothers, Ron and Bob. Sonoda. I mean, the three whitest names my parents could name us, so that we could assimilate as quick as possible, not get beat up in school, and not get picked on. And you know, again, my relationship to being Japanese Canadian is so tied to the internment of my parents, because when they were let out of the camps and they, you know, they had to go either east of the Rockies or back repatriate back to Japan, they ended up in Hamilton. And you know, I didn't learn Japanese as a kid, except for the bad words that my parents kept using around me. And my brothers, you know, protected me as I was growing up. They were so influential. Where I'm heading with this is, it was hard for me to connect to that side of storytelling, and it literally took me 11 movies to get there.
Yeah.
And I still didn't do it. I made a crime caper movie about two Japanese Canadian brothers that play the cello and steal a bag of money, and it's not about, you know, the internment experience. It's not about, you know, there was a great so Andrew Chung on Twitter. I don't know if any of you follow him, but he's an amazing filmmaker, and he just posted an interesting tweet, which is log line for literally every new POC filmmaker: an examination of intergenerational trauma, grief, forgiveness, and love. And I think, you know,
I think that's what Donkey Head was about.
but that's, you know, that's kind of where we're at now, where there's a, I don't know if we're being allowed to tell these stories in abundance, or we're being accepted for the stories that we're telling, or if now there's interest in these stories. But I have no idea what the original question was, Sook-Yin.
Or if there's an expectation to proliferate that same narrative. You know, it's interesting. It's, you know, East Asian movies in China and Hong Kong, they don't do like East Asian American, North American movies. They don't get it there in Hong Kong and China. They're like, why is it such a big deal for the identity thing? Like, I understand North Americans are dealing with the identity struggle, but like in China and Hong Kong, they're just telling narratives and they don't necessarily have to talk about their identity. It's
well, and you know, Sook-Yin, you and I came up through the Much Music gauntlet of the 90s and early 2000s. And, you know, being a music video director, I was 21 when I kind of started professionally. And, you know, I remember, you know, when RT started directing and I was there, it's like there was a handful of us. And not only were we the youngest ones on set, we were oftentimes the only BIPOC people on set. And the race to feel welcomed and belonging to that environment was real, where I didn't want to stand out too much, but at the same time, it was about the work. And if you could do the work, you know, there's a place for you in this industry. But it's interesting to see the shift now in like the change in getting your perspective, your point of view, and your worldview across is coming at a premium now, and I think that's great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, all of you create idiosyncratic movies, express yourselves in your work. I'm wondering what motivated you to want to tell your own story rather than fit into someone else's narrative. Agam?
When you say fit into someone else's narrative, you mean
Yeah, like, you know,
someone else's, or
yeah, I mean, why did you want to tell your own stories as opposed to necessary? I mean, you do work as an actor in other people's films, so you do support people like Deepa Mehta, her vision, but as a storyteller yourself, you wanted to tell your own stories. You all find your story, your perspective, and proliferate that. That's different than not. You know, what made you initially want to tell express your own perspectives?
I think for me it was frustration. I'd been acting for 18 years professionally. Now it's been 18 years. And I've had a very blessed career as an actor, but the one thing I hadn't done is be number one on the call sheet. And I wanted to know what that was like.
Yes.
And you know, it's really interesting because I have, like, throughout all of these years, seen the shift that's been happening in the industry, and you know, it does seem like there is definitely more diversity, but it's just, to me, it's not enough when it's just still supporting a white narrative, when it's still the supporting actors and, you know, the principal actors or the extras. Like, that's always, you know, you walk on set and you always see the extras as like the most diverse, and then like the core cast as not, you know. And so it was really kind of killing me inside. I think my artist was really sad and frustrated. Like, why do I have to write this thing in order to just to be number one on the call sheet? You know, so but it's what I had to do.
Yes, absolutely. And you
so
did
that
it.
was really my motivation. Like the main thing. And then it obviously became something else after that.
Yes. Triple, quadruple threat. So vastly talented. Donkey had blew me out of the water when I saw it. Loved it. My favorite Canadian film of recent note. And I watched a bunch this weekend. And you not only wrote, directed, starred in it, and did a great job. You probably did it with style and aplomb, and I don't doubt that you made a beautiful set behind the scenes. So appreciated. And yes, that frustration of not being number one. Sandy, what about you?
Yeah, I just want to also give props to Agam. Like, hearing about what you've done is so inspiring. But yeah, I think for me, you know, I grew up in the Maritimes, so super, super white. And I kind of fell into these creative things. I don't think fell in makes it sound like it wasn't something I was seeking, but I think it was just, you know, I did these things, you know, filmmaking, comedy, just so I felt like I had a voice. I felt like no one really cared to hear. They weren't really searching for what I had to say. And these were mediums where I could just kind of be myself and just express myself. So yeah, I feel like I'm going off on weird tangents, but yeah, I think I just always saw it as a way to finally have a voice, even if, you know, the audience is non-existent. It was just like, yeah, suddenly being able to speak.
And it's bold to do that. It's like a girl with a guitar, you know, comedy, to be the funny person and stand up on stage and do like stand up. It's very bold. Warren, what about you? What motivated you?
You know, as a television director now, I'm still a servant of other narratives, and I'm still curious and wanting to tell different stories. So when as a contract director going on a TV series, you know, I get the script and I try to make it the best story possible.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not a centered Asian perspective comes out of it, I don't know. I try to just, you know, you get the script, you analyze it, you come up with how you're going to tell the story and the shots and the blocking, and you collaborate with the actors in terms of what to get out of the scene and try to put your crew in the best position possible to be successful. But when it comes to your personal story, and when you talk about your own work, it's to do things to do for money. I took the episode of Murdoch Mysteries I just did, and I put it right into the movie. Did the Indiegogo campaign, assembled the crew. My wife and her team at Film Coop and Abby Fettergreen, they all came together to tell this crazy story about two cello players. And at the end of it, it's funny. It's an uneven movie. I mean, it's like we swung for the fences, and I'm not saying it's great cinema, but I'm so proud of it because like I made it for my brothers basically to watch and like get a kick out of it, and also for the two brothers that star in the film. But of the small smattering of critical responses to it, there was a sort of essence of, if it wasn't just about the guns, and if they just centered around these two cello playing brothers. And I thought it was interesting because it's a bit of a codified way of saying it makes me uncomfortable to see this taking the space of a Danny Boyle movie or a Snatch or a Heat or a crime caper film. It'd be a little bit more appetizing if it was just about the cultural experience of being Japanese cello players, which wasn't the purpose of making the movie. I wanted to inhabit the space of a crime caper.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of the journey of that movie, and the next one will probably be the same thing, where it's like, and it also speaks to like we need more BIPOC film critics out there. We need more, in the cultural industries. We need our own people watching the content we create so that they can gauge it with their perspective. Right?
For sure. Yeah,
that's a whole other conversation.
Well, we're going to get there because I want to talk about industry and systemic situations, but just sort of getting a sense of your own personal stories of what brought you to this moment here. I mean, for me, growing up in Vancouver, I started to go for auditions as a teenager. And I needed money because I was living on my own. I left home very young. And I was just constantly getting cast as like, why is every role named Jade? Jade. And then I was like, cast as a science student whose father was a firecracker maker. It's just like really cliche stuff, or the quote unquote Vietnamese crack beep beep beep.
Yeah.
Who's the comedy relief in an American drama, and I couldn't believe
Dragon Lady sort of,
yeah, or the trashy sex worker who is a comic relief and is completely stereotypically created. And there I was on set where the director is like, improvise. My sidekick was a small person, and they called him a very derogatory name, who is also behind the scenes a brilliant theater maker. And I'd go to his little room and he'd tell me all about absurdist theater and Samuel Beckett, and vastly talented. And they're bring on the crack, blah blah blah, and the blah blah blah. And then the director's like, I want you to improvise in Vietnamese and really, really, tear a strip. I'm like, I don't speak, I'm not Vietnamese. And he's like, just do it. And I literally screamed everything that I knew in Chinese, which was like children's talk or like bad words, like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Life is slippery. Don't be afraid to fall. I'm gonna hit you. Hurry up and eat. Like this sort of stuff. And they're like,
I need the bathroom.
They're like, great. So I was like, I'm perpetuating something very bad here. I'm part of the system. I need this money, but this is horrible. So I extricated myself from acting. And this is as a very young person. And I started to make my own. I entered a contest by the NFB, Escapades of the One Particular Mr. Noodle, about my job walking the streets of Vancouver dressed as a 10-foot egg noodle. And it was a sort of parallel to my identity as a Chinese Canadian young person, really lost and confused. And I got that accepted, and I was on my way, and I didn't want to contribute to that system anymore. So it's and here we are.
I want to see that movie. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, it's up. It's on. I posted on. You can see it. It's on.
I'll check it out.
Free for all to see. I'm wondering, what's one of the obstacles you've encountered as you are now as professionals in this industry that made it harder for you to tell your story? An obstacle that you're like, boom, oh God, how am I going to get over this one? I mean, we are problem solvers, and I trust you were able to wrestle with that one and make your thing happen. But what's one obstacle you encountered within this industry that made it hard or a challenge for you to tell your story? Does anyone want to grab that one?
I'll jump in, and we kind of talked about this in the preamble of gatekeeping in terms of there is a push now. Data moves policy, and the one thing that I've learned at the DGC is, if we have a really good team, and we do, our staff is fantastic, and they're big believers in big data that can actually not just move policies but move practices. And I remember when Dr. Amanda Coles did Who's Sitting in the Director's Chair, which was a seminal piece of reporting on gender parity in Canadian film and television. And when the numbers came out, and it was 7%, and it went to 11%, it was abysmal representation of storytellers that were identified as female. And when that came out, the data could not be, you couldn't argue against it. So that was, I think, 2000, I want to say 17, somewhere in there. I was just pretty new at the Guild in terms of being an elected there. But it almost changed things within the first couple of years of this data being out, where, I was seeing sets which was predominantly male to now closer to parity, and sometimes beyond that, which is phenomenal. And I think that's important. I think actually telling the truth about where we're at and taking a temperature check as to how we're doing is important. I know all the major organizations, including the DGC, but also Telefilm, who's part of this, and the NFB are doing internal checks. But it's what we do with that data that's going to be important. Your question is like, what sort of barriers to access did I encounter?
Yeah.
So I'm not really answering it, but what I'm saying is part of the solution to these barriers will be actually painting an accurate picture of what's out there. And then for me personally, I kind of did what you did, Sook-Yin, and like, I had to work, right? We had to make money. I love my mom and dad, but I didn't come from an affluent family. I had no connections to the film industry whatsoever. I showed up in Toronto as an 18-year-old. I failed film school twice at Ryerson. Like, I just didn't have the means to be self-sufficient without working. And it was all about the work. And I didn't let any sort of prescribed idea of like, why you to get the job. I became the go-to Canadian country music video director, and it's so Japanese Canadian, because you wouldn't think the kid from Hamilton, Ontario would be doing so many country music videos, but it was a safe place for me. It great clients, wonderful songs, big budgets, and but then I look at it, it's like, well, what part of me is actually in there? And it was the assimilated side of me that was telling the stories. Again, I'm not answering your question, so I'll hand it over to my cohorts here. So sorry for not answering your question.
Sandy, what about you? Like, what's and we're going to get to solutions too, because that's a big part of this discussion. But I want to kind of get a sense of like obstacles. I'll throw one out. You know, trying to make a feature movie that's a lot of people, a lot of hands are in there, and to get distribution, like you need to have very many dominoes for the financing. And so, you know, the distributors have a list of bankable artists, bankable actors. They have a list of who you can hire and who you can't, because some people are deemed to not bring a box office. And it's very arbitrary. It's subjective. It's not even based upon data sometimes, because one person's list will be very different from the others. And they're usually skew very white, because the white actors are very popular. So if you're going to make a larger film, you're going to be hamstrung by the demands of the distributors, who, of course, you know, Telefilm and your producers are beholden to as well. They're all interconnected. And so it kind of like narrows it down. So oftentimes—
But who are those distributors? Most of them, you know, are not BIPOC, are not.
No, absolutely. There you have.
Yeah.
Boots Riley spoke out, you know, Sorry to Bother You, a great film, North American, you know, he's an African-American filmmaker, also a musician from a great band, made a great film that did gangbusters in the United States, Sorry to Bother You. And he said that international distributors would not touch his movies because they said that that Black movies don't do well. Now, is that true? Or is it just how their system operates? You know, so that's one thing that I've had to really navigate in order to make my movies happen. Anyone else wanna offer an obstacle?
I've had two that come to mind, and one of them was when I planned to make Donkey Head. I wrote it. I wanted to act in it. I've always wanted to be a director, but I didn't plan to direct this film, and so I was looking for a director. And I was looking for a director who had as much experience on set as I had as an actor. So I searched, and there is this one very, very talented South Asian Canadian director who I actually am a huge fan of, but she's Hindu and I am Sikh Punjabi. And so even her take on the story was very different than mine. And she didn't understand certain nuances. And then I approached a director who I had worked with before. He's had success at TIFF and with Telefilm, Robert Cuffley, white male, wonderful person. And I gave him the script, he read it, he liked it. I'm like, great, do you want to direct it? And he's like, no, Agam, this is not my story to tell. It's yours. And I was like, well, I want to act in it. He's like, you can do both and I'll help you, I'll mentor you. And that was like a huge allyship. But before I said yes, I was like, no, there has to be someone else. The thing is that now that we're living in this world about who is the author of the story, 95% of the directors I've worked with in my life have been white male. Right. The other 5% have been, you know, like female or men of color, women of color. So that really shrinks my network of people to this big. And then when you're looking at, I'm like, well, if I can't have a white man telling the story, then it shouldn't be right to have a white female telling the story either. So that leaves women of color. Or possibly men of color, but I wanted it to be a female voice if I was supposed to be really authentic about this. And then I'm looking and I'm like, but then I'm at a disadvantage because Deepa is already busy. And it's like, who do I choose? Like who, you know, Mina Sham is already busy. Like there's really not that many women who have had lots of experience on set as directors in this country. And yet we're supposed to be looking at our own people telling our own stories, but who don't necessarily have the same resources, the same experiences. So it's a disadvantage. Right. So my only alternative really was that I had to direct it myself because I've been on set so many years and I wasn't willing to give it to someone who's done, you know, maybe 2 short films.
Yeah.
and not that they're not incredible filmmakers, but they don't have the experience that I wanted them to have, you know, in order to hand this over. So I think that's kind of an interesting space to be in as people as BIPOC filmmakers and storytellers and creators, is that on one hand, where the expectation is to have an even playing field, and yet the resources aren't there. And then the second thing I'll just say briefly, you know, I'm developing this TV show, and with a Canadian, I guess, a broadcaster, and one of their the requirements is that the show has to be, because of their audience, 51% in a different language, which brings up all sorts of issues and things that I really bump up against, because it to me it feels like tokenism. To me it feels like, well, you want it 51% in Punjabi, and yet you want to have it who are these actors that we're actually going to be leaning on in order for this to be good quality work,
Right.
you know? And that's where the divide is having these requirements, and yet wanting it to be a standout thing, and yet not understanding just the fact that, first of all, Punjabi is a dying language, so really it's only an older percentage of people who really speak it, you know. I don't even speak Punjabi very well, and so it's just it's
Right.
not like French. You know what I mean?
That's
So yeah, it's just bringing up a lot of stuff that is very frustrating to navigate.
God. That's when like data and percentages and all that stuff kind of like, that's a special dance. You have to do a very specific, and if it's an elder crowd, will they be interested in your voice? You know?
Yeah, and it doesn't seem to really matter.
You ruin the audience in Donkey Head. The older folks might not want to see the full moon.
Exactly.
Sandy, what's an obstacle you've encountered that you had to push through?
I think, you know, working especially in documentary, it can, I mean, financing all of that is very tricky. And it's, for me, I'm realizing how important it is to find, like Agam mentioned, just producers or people to collaborate with who understand the vision or why it's important. And I think, especially as someone who's a bit newer to, you know, filmmaking, there are so many programs that really target BIPOC individuals to get them in and give them sort of, you know, these entry-level jobs, but it feels like there's way fewer, much less focus on retaining them, and also making sure that, I mean, like I had a lot of trying experiences that just make you less motivated to keep going. And I feel like that's such a like story we hear with so many filmmakers of color. So I think, yeah, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's mentors or, you know, just a support system to help encourage people to keep going. Because I think you see a lot of filmmakers of color and Asian filmmakers who might make one film and then that's it for the rest of their lives. Like, I'm really curious about retention and yeah, nurturing careers along. So for me, yeah, as someone who's only done short films, and, you know, I'm working on a feature, I can't even envision, you know, who I would get to help make it happen. And yeah, it's a really daunting thing. So it's like all these little obstacles that turn into a mountain, I think, once you sort of get your foot in the door.
I mean, in terms of the solution, Agam, you've been able to, you push through this situation to be able to make your movie. And so what was key to unlocking it? I mean, it's fabulous. Array, Eva DuVernay's company, she's very incredibly talented, brilliant American filmmaker. You have them as a distributor. And so I was trying to look for it, and it was like, I emailed you, I was like, it's not on Netflix Canada. And you're like, it's on Netflix America. You've been championed by an American company as an export, a Canadian export, exposing your movie to a big audience. it's a great success. How did you make that happen?
Well, I kind of live two lives. I have one foot in Canada and one foot in the States. And to be honest, it's I see that as really beneficial, because I think Canada has a lot to offer. And I mean, we have government grants that no one else does. And it's been like this. So the only reason why Donkey Head really was made for what it was made for. And so there are champions. And I also want to really like point out people like Robert Cuffley, like that. I think that's such a true meaning of allyship when we're talking about allyship. And so people like that I have encountered. But I like to have one foot in America. I work here as an actor, and I worked with Ava on a show. We developed a relationship, and then I just submitted it to them. But I think it's just the conversation about diversity to me feels so much further in the States than it does in Canada. And you're allowed to get angry, and you're allowed to have like big opinions about it, and to align, there are people to align yourself with. It doesn't mean that it's easy, but at least it feels like there is like stuff that's happening. Sometimes I'm grateful for panels like this. I really, really am. And I know that there is a desire, but it just sometimes feels like there's like things kind of like there's such a politeness in Canada that I personally doesn't necessarily work with my personality, because I can be a little like just angry and blunt. So I find that it doesn't, I'm not able to, I don't know, there's no distributors either that really will like empower, I think, a film like Donkey Head across Canada. I have a Canadian distributor. They've been fine, but it didn't feel like it was really like exciting to them, or a priority, you know? So yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question, but I think having one foot in as many different territories as you can in order to have the biggest
it's great that you weren't you didn't throw in the towel. You search for more opportunities, and you identify personal connections, working relationships. You work with Ava. You submitted because you had that personal thing, and they recognized it as good. So kudos to you for plowing through that instead of feeling kind of bad when other people didn't champion you. And I'm also glad that Robert Cuffley said no to directing, because then you had to look in the mirror and direct it yourself, and you did it, which is great. There's been a popularity of movies like Shang-Chi, and also Crazy Rich Asian film. What's that? Crazy Rich
Asians.
Crazy Rich Asians. Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a kind of trend where there's more visibility and popularity of East Asian films in North America. What do you think? What do you think has pushed this trend?
Money. They make money. There's an audience.
Money.
You know, I mean, that's the only thing. At that level, at the Marvel level.
Yeah.
They realize there's an audience for it, and you know, thank God Simu got it, because he elevated that story, and you know, just his story alone is inspirational, and hopefully will make many more actors go, hey, you know, I belong too. There's a space for me here.
Yeah, that's true. And at the same time, Asian stereotypes continue to proliferate on screen, whether it's the erasure of Muslims in Dune, or Asian movies dominated by martial artists. I'm wondering, why is it still hard for Asians to get beyond a cultural stereotype or a sidekick character?
Because we're not telling the stories all the time, you know? I think the more we get to tell our own stories, the more we'll veer away from that. I don't know. I honestly think it's the type of films like Sandy and Agam are making that center their Asianness in a way that is accessible, but like truly, you know, realistic and authentic. When you're talking about authentic storytelling, But you can only do that when you take it upon yourself to tell that story, and otherwise, people will default to what they've seen before or heard before. And if you're
Yeah.
not Asian and you have an Asian character, that's built up over decades of reinforcement of the stereotype.
Mhm.
I think.
Yeah. And anyone else have any thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I just think that, these are also between East and South Asians there, that each culture has such a rich filmmaking history and industry too. So I feel like it's just people finally catching up, and yeah, I that's how I see it as well.
Mhm.
I think sometimes it's human nature to not want to move over and to create space. Like it's just, if you have a voice, if you're seen and heard, it's not the most natural thing to be like, okay, I'll give a little bit of this to you.
Yeah.
And so I think that is part of what's happening. Like you want to see the people who are making these stories want to see themselves, like they want to see themselves reflected, and they don't necessarily want to see someone that they have to do research on and give them, that's not their priority. So maybe that's a little bit about it.
Yeah, the giving up of power, the giving up of space. We're reared in this society that means that we're going to lose our power if we give power and space over. It's really hard to undo.
I'd like to actually just echo what Sandy said earlier about leveling up, which is a barrier to access, because Canada has a rich history of debut feature films. Really hard to get your second movie. Really hard to get your third. There's a handful of us that have done 5, 6, 7 movies, but like that means you're making a movie. And Sook-Yin, we've been through this. It's like you make a movie every 7 or 8 years. Is that a career, or is that you get
A hobby?
A hobby. You get to facilitate a story every once in a while. And
Yeah.
Agam, I really hope it's not 8 years before we see another story from you. You know what I mean? And obviously you're on a path where that won't be the case. But yeah, that's one of the
that is a potentiality. You're illuminating that. I mean, what's interesting for me is during the lockdown, we saw a lot was revealed, and there was a lot of protest around inequality, around the need for inclusion, a lot of political activism for addressing inequity. And it seemed like it hit the mainstream. Everyone on big award shows wearing a ribbon that indicated this or that or the other, et cetera, et cetera. And despite all of our calls for diversity and inclusion, it seems like even though everyone wants to look good and say they're doing that, that there's almost been a doubling down, I see sometimes, of like the same old system being perpetuated, but now they're saying, oh, but we're doing this. And then you research a little further and it's like, that seemed like an empty performative gesture rather than actual meaningful change. I mean, many of the bosses and gatekeepers, as Warren had said earlier, from showrunners to producers, critics, distributors, and investors are white. So how does that shape what's on screen? How does that shape what's on screen and the way business is done?
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to reference what you said earlier, Warren, that in the case of critics of color, I feel like so much nuance is lost when people don't, I don't think you have to belong to the culture or identity that's being represented in the film, but it can provide so much more layered insight. And I think that would be a huge help if there were more critics of color, or just, people who are used to being sort of on the margins. They might look at something in a totally different way, but there's such a homogenous, that's such a homogenous field, film criticism.
Or what's even worse, they won't even critique it. They won't even pick it up. I was very fortunate to work on R.T. Thorne's Utopia Falls, which was one of the most diverse experiences I've ever had, both in front and behind the camera, and not one Canadian, critical entity picked it up and talked about it. There was just a disinterest, and maybe part of it is embedded in the systemic nature of where we're at, and that has to change. And as much as we need to change, like you said, Sook-Yin, the avenues of distribution, the C-suite level, the executive level at corporations and organizations. If we're not talking about the stories that we're doing, if Donkey Head is not first and foremost on the critics' mind, even if they don't like the movie, it's like if they're not talking about the stories we're telling, then we are in that vacuum, and it's really hard to break through.
Yeah, I don't even know how to change that thing. Like even cultural critics, they went from being able to write longer things, and now they're capsule reviews. Even if like Now Magazine doesn't even have, like suddenly it was like all the critiques went away. You can now it's back online, but
and Rad is fighting the good fight there, right? He's invested in making sure that there's a voice still.
Yeah.
But the publishing is a whole other conversation.
It was fascinating to see the whole sort of Kim's convenience saga go out. Simu and Jin Yoon cast characters, illuminating the inequities behind the scenes. A very well loved show, first series based on In's Choi's play, very great, cemented a big audience. But then no more after that. He kind of left the scene, and then when it collapsed, they were very vocal about not being invited to the writer's room, actually being pushed away from the writer's room, that, predominantly white execs dictating the narratives that were inauthentic, and them having to say, actually, in Korean culture, you would never, that sort of stuff. So it was like, but then seeing Globe and Mail critic cover it and have see a Twitter war between Simu and John Doyle of the Globe and Mail, where John Doyle's trying to pit him against Inns, and saying, oh, the real star here is Inns. And I tweeted, and Gina and I were like, wait a minute, don't pit them against each other. You're avoiding the bigger conversation about what happened to that show that they're trying to express, and very, very weird. And then he logged off because he stopped his account. Now he's back, and then I don't know, but he's been there for a long time. And there's probably only one position left, and he's going to hang on to it. And then how do we, well, maybe there's a reason why critics, they're not being hired very much. Much of the critical mass is in things like Letterboxd. Letterboxd is a website where film fans can write their own reviews about things. And very intelligent people that aren't necessarily branded as a critic are generously writing their stuff, and it's an interesting site.
Also,
so
that world needs people to lend a hand to raise up the next person, right? And I think this peer group of filmmakers that Sandi and Agam are part of a group of filmmakers that are opening the door and lending the hand, and young filmmakers need to see us to go, there's a place for us. And we talked about authentic storytelling earlier, and my feeling that I don't know if I was an authentic Asian storyteller when I first started, but I existed. And I think that was important, just to show up every day, go on set, and have other people see me there going, oh, okay, I can do that too. I don't just have to be this, that, or I can, ascend to a level of telling our own stories, being a director, being a producer, being a writer, or whatever.
Yeah, and I would argue that you are authentically telling your story. I agree with Agam in that whoever tells a story, that's their perspective, and that is authentic. However way you wish to express that story. It's.
Well, you said also, Warren, you mentioned something earlier about like that's your assimilated side that told us, and we all have that. We all have that assimilated side. I think that's just as valid as
for sure
the other part.
Warren, you're the head of the DGC, the Directors Guild of Canada. Sandy and I have worked for institutions like the NFB and the CBC in the public sector. Thank goodness, as Agam says, we do have support for the arts in this country. And much of it exists within the public sector. But at the same time, there's a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion and representation, and not enough talk about processes, working processes, how we can enable concrete working practices to change, to benefit everything. So I'm wondering what are some specific working practices that you would like to see change, that you think would be a great solution to make this a better system?
Well, we all have work to do. I mean, the Guild had a big step forward when they elected myself and Tracy Deer as the first vice president of the first, Japanese Canadian, first Mohawk, first vice president to be on the national executive. And we're seeing that throughout the industry, where the elected are slowly being, inclusive, which is fantastic. I can only speak to the Guild of what we've been doing, and R.T. Thorne is the chair of our BIPOC members committee. And that committee came up with sort of 5 pillars, which I think actually works for the entire industry. And the first one is outreach and trust building. Trust building is so important you just can't outreach. Like, we can do this panel, and we've all been a part of panels like this, but we have to go into communities and actually build a relationship with the people in them.
Yeah.
Gain trust.
Yeah. So
why should they
work with you?
Yeah. Why should, someone in a community that has no idea what the film industry is trust the DGC or the WGC or ACTRA when we have not been in their communities showing them what we do and how to do it, and that there's a path forward. The second one is barriers to access, which we've been talking about, is identifying them and trying to find solutions to get them down. Data collection, again, I said before, so important. And this is what we were talking about earlier, of training, support, and sustainability. And the fifth one is leveling up, being able to make sure that you have an arc. It's kind of easy to get in the film industry. You show up. This is the one industry where you can show up with no experience, no real skill. But if you show up and you want to put the work in, there could be a place for you. But how do you get from that level to where you might really want to go? And there are definite barriers to access.
Yeah, that's a very hard, because the whole industry, entertainment industry, seems to be built on a militaristic design hierarchy. And so
and I've talked about the pyramid of, number one is at the top, and the background extras, performers are at the bottom.
Yeah, and they have to eat crappy food over in that little parking lot over there.
And as you get up to the top of the pyramid, you
get your Winnebago.
Yeah, what is the demographic as you get higher to the top? So those are the 5 things that we identified as things that we need to do better at and work on. And I think it's indicative of the entire industry. And I know each guild and union are doing their own sort of reflective moments of figuring out, well, what are we going to do? What is the path forward? Because we have to do this. It's mission critical, and it's not just we'll feel better because it's not performative. It's a market-driven thing. This is something the market is saying they want, is more diversified workforce, whether it's BIPOC, gender, LGBTQ+, filmmakers with disabilities. They want this, and we need to figure out a way to make sure that it happens. So that's
I mean, it does boil down to hard work. It's very easy to stay within the comfort of an office. I see this, within casting. I wanted to cast an actor whose English was their second language, and literally was sent just a lot of people pretending accents. And I was like, what's going on? What? How? Why? Well, that's the only people we have, because probably they didn't have working relations with the community. They didn't. So then it's incumbent, then I go into the community. But then that opens a whole can of worms, because maybe that actor is not ACTRA. And then actors like, you should hire this person who's et cetera. that. So it's very, very weird. Does anybody have, Sandy, can you identify, I mean, you worked at this hour is 22 minutes. Can you identify something within that working culture that could change, that you would like to see change? And I put it on the spot here too, because I realize if you don't like, because you might not want to speak out about this because we all have careers and you could find yourself on a whatever, you know, on a shit list.
Well, I thought I don't know if this speaks to 22 minutes really, but what Warren mentioned about trust building is so important. But then also valuing that trust after you establish it on the institution or the production side, protecting those people, supporting them, you know, with my documentary, I don't want to get into the weeds of it all, and I will say that I produced this documentary with the NFB before Rachel was hired, before they had all of this plan to address diversity issues. But we had some weird controversy right after the film had come out. And I was basically being pressured to, how much should I say? So there's a Hall of Fame in the film. They took issue with how they were depicted at some point. They were basically threatening to sue. It was such a silly thing. I think they were obviously bluffing, but I was being pressured to remove that scene entirely. And my film is about, you know, Atlantic Black Canadians. So I had to establish trust with that community just to be able to tell that story. And I saw it as, you know, an act of censorship that they were suggesting. Thankfully, you know, things worked out, but I think what I'm saying is, you know, these institutions are, whoever's benefiting from the optics of looking diverse or progressive really need to do the work behind the scenes and you know, value that trust, because I think it's easy to put a face of color at the forefront, or, you know, benefit from the PR, but when push comes to shove, are you supporting those groups, and are you, you know, acting in a way that's antithetical to the like success, or, you know, to their voices. So that, I think it's a little easier to get your foot in the door, but I'm really more interested in what happens behind the scenes. And it's great that all these institutions are having these plans now. So
I think what you're talking about too is like the fear of litigation. So that's what I mean. Many places are fed fear, especially by the lawyers, that, you know, they could sue, and then like, so maybe there has to be just a little bit more bravery and to kind of know where your moral core is. I mean, they, in this scene, they're walking through the Hockey Hall of Fame and they're noting in what they're seeing an absence of Black hockey players. I mean, what, you're going to say that's not true? Like, I mean, that's what's on behind the window that they're walking through. So what a weird world to have those kinds of conversations with the people who are actually going, oh, maybe we should take it out. You know, people have to start thinking and not being so fearful about this sort of litigation in so many places. I hope that people can be drawn towards being bolder and common sense. And I'm sorry that you had to like have those conversations to push your thing through, but you did. So you did it, and that's great. That's a victory, because you convinced them not to be scared, and the scene is in there, and it makes the documentary all the better. Agam, what are some things that you'd see that you'd like to see change within systems that you have had to work within?
I think from unions, I think especially like ACTRA and UBCP, I know that there's a desire to make changes, But I think it's like a whole sort of restructuring and a rethinking of
Yes.
what it means to be creating content, acting in content, and like sort of this like a breakdown of borders. So by that, what I mean is, so as a person of color, if you know a different language, or even if you don't, you could go abroad and make a film there. But then if the film isn't, like I've been penalized by ACTRA for doing a film that wasn't union, but it was a great role and I wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And so it was a big, it was very dramatic. And I understand their point of view. I understand why they felt like they needed to penalize me, because they're like, we are here to keep people safe. If something had happened, if all the people, the BIPOC individuals, do things that are not union, you're doing a disservice to yourself and to other BIPOC people, because then they're like, well, we can. Sorry, I don't feel like I'm explaining this very well, but basically producers come in and they're like, well, but the BIPOC people will go for this lesser job.
The discount.
Yeah. And so I get it, but at the same time, it doesn't, like, the way they're going about it.
It sounds like a mind screw though.
It is, because like what's happening, for instance, is like, as a person of color, I want to have a great opportunity. I want to do this thing. They're not going to become union, so I'm going to do it.
Yes,
and so, and so would many people. And so you can't, like, there's nobody sort of willing to sort of bend. Like, the union isn't necessarily willing to bend. And then also I know people who are, they speak different languages, and there's a lot of productions that come to Canada, Vancouver, Surrey, who do work, and these really great actors get a chance to also work there, but they're not going to be doing union work, and so it's like everybody's kind of doing it under the radar, hoping nobody finds out, but it's like, we shouldn't have to do that. So there has to be a better way. And it's a very like Eurocentric way of kind of thinking about union.
And also protected. That whole thing about space that we were talking about, not letting space. And I'm really glad that you bring this up, because it's a contentious issue. I never joined ACTRA because most of my work is in weird little art films. And I knew that if I joined that, I wouldn't be able to do weird little art films. So I never did. So instead, by the rules, whenever I get a regular gig, I would buy a permit. I'd pay to be in there. And that's above board. That's all good. They were good with that. But now they're really pressuring me to join. I'm like, but I never get work in big things. I do weird, freaky art films. Why would I do that? So then I was offered a gig, and they penalized me. I'm not even a member, but they penalized me up like it would have ended me having to pay to be in this movie because of all the penalizations racked up to be. They're like, well, we have to 4 times because you did. I'm like, what? I'm broke, right? I'd love to make this movie, but they're broke. And anyway, I just had to say to the production, I can't do it because I can't afford it, because they are made, and I'm not even in there. And I tried to talk, but there is no talking. And we're talking about giving voice to people that do not have access to the industry. I got a Canada Council grant to make my next movie, huzzah. And one of their things is like, you have to be totally the producer. You have to be the creative person. You don't anyone. I'm like, that sounds good. And therefore I can hire people like Khan, who I met as an Uber delivery food guy on Christmas Eve, hung out, became friends. He's a brilliant artist and musician. He's now in my movie. That wouldn't happen where can we create space for people like Khan and myself? That's weird. I'm a mainstream person,
Yeah, sorry, Sook-Yin, I think we're going over the time right now. So sorry.
Oh, geez.
Okay,
okay, that's Viola.
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay, so
over. So let's just address one question from the audience, and then
Okay.
So
Let's-
yeah, sorry. Let's just address one question from the audience, and then let's wrap up afterwards.
Okay. So I feel like
No, let's keep going. Let's just talk for the next 3 hours.
yeah, I mean, I feel like we're at a very intense moment, and how do we wrap this to
I know, yeah.
get over? So is systemic change possible, do you think, panelists?
Absolutely. Well, 100%. 100%. Why else are we in this?
And how do we
don't think the systems, if we don't think the systems can ultimately change, you know?
And how do we enable this to happen?
Time and pressure.
I don't know. I do believe that there, like, we have to believe that there's change. I get so frustrated with how polite the whole Canadian system is. And sometimes I'm just like, why don't we just blow it up? And I know that's such a childish thing to say, but I don't know if like we can keep talking and we can keep, being like, signing things, but I'm just like, people should know that Sook-Yin wasn't able to do that thing, like people should know that I got,
yeah, and we're like our panel's like, and we have to end the panel just as things get juicy. It's like, okay.
But I think there just needs to be like a lot, we need to be more vocal and not so polite about it, and I know that it gets ugly and it's so uncomfortable, and
yeah, we always want to put a bow on it, like everything is okay, but we can't put a bow on it or make things unless we actually identify, and there seems to be a great deal of fear of litigation, fear of call outs that are dictating what we're seeing, and I wish we weren't so afraid. We could identify what's not working and then move forward, creating new systems as well. I mean, I sometimes wonder. I mean, I was looking at the Audre Lorde quote, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him as his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all of our lives in this time and place. I urge each and one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives here. See whose face it wears. Then the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all of our choices. I feel like that is so true. And I wonder if there is possible room for systemic change or the building of alternative systems. I hope so. Teresa, you're here. You want us to answer a question. Now, there's all these questions in the chat. Is there any particular one here that has caught your attention?
I'm going to look to Viola. Other questions? Because I've been listening.
Yeah.
And making notes of this great conversation that's been happening. So I don't know. I don't see the questions.
Oh, you don't see them in the chat? Looking over here, guys, Viola, is there one in particular that you think has got some grist there?
I think we have addressed some of the questions because we've talked about change and like what we want to see for the future of the industry and stuff like that. So there's one question, that was the first question that came in. I think I typed it in the chat to you. I don't know if you have seen it, but I'm a Sri Lankan Canadian that finished a first draft of a feature film. The thing is, I'm pretty assimilated, and I wonder if my script is less because of that, less authentic, less representative, whatever. How can I fix that? That's the first question that came in. So I just wanted to address this question from all the panelists, and then we can just wrap up the event after this.
The question in itself to me feels like, so that's your story. This is your story, and you're wondering, do I have to change it? Do I have to change my story to be more acceptable? Or I mean, none of us are well, Warren, you're kind of like a bit of a gatekeeper, but I don't know what goes on in the meetings there. Are they going to go, oh, we need a more Chinesey story? You know, or is that what they're saying?
I don't know. I'm not part of the curating at Telefilm, but or you know, some of these funding agencies. But just from my own experiences, no. I mean, you know, this conversation has reinforced, you know, my belief that, hey, tell the best story possible. Don't cater to someone else's taste. Find your perspective. Find your point of view. Don't, you know, and double down on it. Don't waver from it. And don't second guess it. Just tell the story the best way you can.
Yeah, isn't that weird that the conformity is opposite now? It's like, oh, now you know, you could throw in all these things that seem to be kind of sizzly, you know, about around race and so forth, and then get your script accepted.
I will say this, Sook-Yin, to your big question of, is systemic change possible?
Yeah.
I just want to, and you commented on it before, because we all remember what happened in that first year of the pandemic with George Floyd, in the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement. It was that was really the churning of the sea of change. We're in year one of what will be a 20-year, you know, day in, day out challenge for a lot of us. And you know, if the parity issue file is any indication, you know, it takes 5 years to really go from policy to practice. You were talking about it earlier, of like, what are the practices that actually we're going to be doing, and like we're so,
oh my God,
in the infancy of it,
right?
And I hope, Agam, that it changes fast enough for you to keep making movies here, because we want to see more of yours, and yours as well, Sandy.
Yeah, for sure. Viola is, or does anybody want to address that question? Should she feel like she's, as an assimilated person of color, that she needs to make it more a different narrative in order for it to be accepted by the governing bodies? Does Sandy, Agam, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think like a lot of people can relate to that, what that person's articulating. So I think it's relatable. I think that is authentic. The idea that we have to fake authenticity to be authentic, you know, it's kind of making my brain scramble around trying to wrap myself. I think it's easy to, you know, second guess yourself in any sort of creative thing, but I think that person should feel, you know, a little more okay and at peace, and just write what they're thinking and feeling.
Yeah, for sure. Viola, can you send us another question?
I think we don't really have that much time left, so let's just go to Teresa for closing remarks, if you are good to wrap up the conversation. Because Teresa has to go in a few minutes.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Well, I think, you know, Warren putting that into perspective, that it is sort of in its infancy. I mean, I hope that systems and institutions can hurry up a bit, because that's a long time. 20 years is too long to actually enable change. And I hope that we can all also put our heads together to think of what needs to change, and also what new ways of doing things. Teresa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
For talking to me, for sharing your experiences.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Sook-Yin, for facilitating this very dynamic and fast-moving dialogue, and lots of reflection from me. Actually, I've been part of this kind of conversation since the 1980s, so definitely things have not been moving fast enough. And so I think through this you know, hour and a half long conversation, you started with really reminding us about the complexity of dealing with our identities as Canadians, and fighting against assimilation, our earning for our yearning for belonging and finding your own voice and being truthful and being yourself. And you enable our participants, our panelists, to share the experience of frustration, sadness, anger, fear, and recognizing that that the change have been slow. And you touch on, but I think we were also encouraged by what Warren said, that this is the time of opportunity, that our worldview, your perspective, the unique experiences of Canadians of diverse background are now welcomed. So I like to believe systemic change, structural change is possible, because that's what I've been doing the past 40 years in my small ways. And I have to believe it because I have 3 grandchildren.
Yeah.
So, and what all of you shared is universal in a way, because I'm a social worker. The people in the who are dealing with the justice system, education system, social system are all saying the same thing. We need to build trust, right? Our institutions need to earn trust.
We also have to be interested in other communities.
Right. So I think that thank you for sharing all those perspectives and wise words with all of us this afternoon. And before closing, I would like to take a few minutes to speak about CRF commitment towards financially supporting community initiatives. The CRF has launched the National Anti-Racism Fund to support events and youth initiatives. Each funding stream has a different criteria and different amounts of available funding. If you're interested to learn more, please check out our website, www.crf-fcrr.ca for more information. Thank you all for attending this event. I hope you learned something new, as I did, and found the discussion inspiring. Please sign up to receive our regular newsletters to remain updated about our events and programs. In the meantime, you can also follow us on social media. All this information available in the chat box. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you. Are we here still?
And we're out.
Can you? I wanted to take a screen grab of all of us. Is it possible to put us in?